This is a job that thousands of people would die to have, and I recognize that. I would say that, honestly, the biggest break that I ever got was failing out of business school in college. All right, welcome to Willing to Fail. I'm your host, Peyton Bennett, as usual. And today we got a very special guest. You've seen him on ESPN. He's a content producer for Get Up. He also contributes to the Baseball Tonight podcast. His stats are a regular occurrence on the Pat McAfee Show. He's also a co-author of the best-selling book, Got Your Number, with Mike Greenberg. With no further ado, Paul Hembo, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm doing great. I appreciate you having me. It seems like you and I have an awful lot in common. So I have a funny feeling that our conversation is going to fly by today. That's what I would say for sure.
Yeah, I get a lot of DMs on the WTF stats page of like these kids that are like passionate about sports stats and they want to get into like the stats career. And I'm like, I'm not really the guy to ask, man. I just post stuff on Instagram. But you're definitely the person to ask because this is, your full-time career. So I just want to start from the beginning, like, where you're from. I saw that you're from Baltimore, but I know you're a big Philly fan. So I'm kind of curious about what your upbringing is and how sports and your parents were involved in creating you.
Sure. So I was born in 1990 in the city of Baltimore. And so what you need to know there is that Cal Ripken Jr. was the biggest reason why I fell in love with sports, as you might expect. Like most kids born in Baltimore in the year 1990, because I was coming to age as a sports fan as he was passing Lou Gehrig's record of consecutive games played, 2130, of course. And I think his breaking that record was a huge reason why I fell in love with the game of baseball, which was my first love. And naturally, I came to love and enjoy all sports. But, baseball first and foremost was that for me, having sort of devoured it when I grew up, having played it all the way up through college. That's, I would say, my love, first, last, and always. But when I was a young person, my family did move to Philadelphia. And I've basically been a Phillies fan, an Eagles fan, a Flyers fan, a Sixers fan for the last 25 years or so. So the Orioles were sort of how I got my start in sports. And I've been an insufferable Philly fan for the last 25 years, which I know rubs you the wrong way because you were a passionate fan of the Atlanta Braves with a checkered past playing the Phillies in the postseason. So I would say from the very beginning, that sort of informs my story. I think Cal Ripken was sort of the first sports idol that I had. That was a torch that Chase Utley wound up catching from him. And I would say those are probably my two favorite ball players of all time. The two athletes that probably informed my fandom more than any other.
Okay. Yeah, I saw in high school you played a lot of sports, baseball being the main one. And like you said, you played baseball through college. And like myself, it looks like you played second base, which for me was because I was the smallest on the team. I don't know if that's the same for you.
Well, I had the fastest hands, but the smallest body. So that's what winds up happening to guys that look like you and me. I was a punch and Judy hitter all the way up through college. First, a little perspective, I slashed 298, 450, 350 in college, and I put those numbers in order. So obviously you're laughing because you know how irregular that is. But you could hit me in the top of any order, at the bottom of any order, but in the middle of no orders. But it's funny because when I was like, I don't know, probably late high school, I read Moneyball, and I kind of became fascinated with analytics at that time. I read baseball. I read baseball books like that, baseball between the numbers and things like that I think sort of informed the way that I think about the game. And as someone that didn't have a lot of power, I asked myself, if I'm likely to only to get a single if I wind up swinging, there's no obvious reason for me not to improve my, the discernment of the strike zone and improve my swing decisions. And that wound up being probably the biggest reason why I had a successful college baseball career, not because I had any skills that, some of my teammates didn't have, but that's the most important thing in baseball is one's ability to discern the difference between a ball and a strike. And as someone that didn't have much power, like the math was pretty obvious, so long as your job is to go up there and not get it out, like most fundamentally. And as one who sort of enjoyed the birth of analytics and sort of came up through that, it actually kind of informed the way that I play baseball. And fast forward that all the way till now kind of informs the way that I watch baseball, talk about baseball, think about baseball, and all the things. And so I'd like to think that I have a pretty healthy blend of I play the game and I know the game and I watch the game. And there are very few people, I think, in this industry, unfortunately, that do all those things well. Like you have, for some reason, baseball is more fractured than the other sports, at least in my opinion, where you have like the sort of get off my lawn, former player, the game used to be better types. And then there's like in the StatCast era types, right? And in reality, like baseball is such a beautiful game for which like the qualitative and the quantitative should be blended. And that's what I do the very best I can, not just when covering or talking about baseball, but any sport. Like we can use the information like the science, and also the beauty, the art, to be able to tell the best stories that we possibly can. And I think I'd like to blend those things in such a way that can inform our audience from both perspectives.
Yeah, I think it's unique, the perspective that you see the game, just because from your own personal experience of having to make that decision of like, yeah, I'm not going to hit 40 home runs, but I'm going to help my team and I'm going to get on base. I think
Yeah.
you were like held some record or broke some records at your college or high school, I saw, for like the most walks. Is that
Yes,
right?
I'm the Cedarville University career leader in walks. I think it's 132 walks, which is funny because I had like 150 hits, which is a super bizarre ratio. But I played baseball via math. Like that's and so like now even when I evaluate like baseball players now, someone asked me yesterday on a different podcast why I don't consider Jimmy Rollins a Hall of Famer. I watched Jimmy Rollins play 1,000 some baseball games, right? And I think a lot of people consider him as someone who might get in someday because he's the guy who has all of like the the shortstop with this many stolen bases and extra bases, right? All the sort of arbitrary endpoint counting stats, which add up to a Hall of Fame resume in a lot of cases. But for me, baseball is a pretty simple game. Like the question you ask yourself in the case of Jimmy Rollins or a lot of players that are on the borderline is, the most important thing in baseball is the answer to the question, how often did you make it out? Or if you're a pitcher, how often did you create one? In the case of Jimmy Rollins, it's a 324 on base percentage. He got out 67.6% of the time. I'm sorry, but you're not a Hall of Fame baseball player unless the rest of the stuff that you did is so obviously disproportionate, because that's the most fundamental skill in the game. And so there are so many attributes to what makes one a great baseball player, but that's the most important one. And I never let myself lose the forest through the trees when thinking about baseball and talking about baseball from that perspective. Again, it sort of informed the kind of player that I became, and it sort of informed the commentator that I became as well.
Interesting. So for your personal opinion of guys getting in the Hall of Fame, is that you put more weight on stats over anything else, or do you put like postseason performance? How much of a weight does that carry?
Okay, it's a great question because it's such a challenging conundrum for so many voters and for so much of the intelligentsia. So I think the way that I like to think about this is basically like a Venn diagram. Obviously, like there's a career value element. Like even if you did play a single postseason game, even if you never finished in the top 3 of an MVP voting or whatever, like if you produced X number of WAR, a certain amount of total quantitative value, think Adrian Beltre, you're a Hall of Famer. The hardest race to run is the marathon. Endurance, in my opinion, is an overlooked, underappreciated aspect of sports. And so for someone like that, right, even if he didn't have that brilliant peak, even if he didn't have those brilliant postseason moments, and he had a few of those, like you're a Hall of Famer. Then there's like the peak value, right? And to me, it's not equally as important, certainly close to equally as important. The comp I make for that attribute is Chase Utley, who over a 5-year period from 2005 to 2009 was the best player in baseball not named Albert Pujols, and had a 5-year stretch matched by only Joe Morgan, basically, when it comes to second baseman since World War II. That also, to me, over a 5-year period is something that says, okay, that's a Hall of Famer because it's a long enough period of time for your peak to be that brilliant. You cross the threshold. And there's obviously the sort of intersection between the two. When it comes to the postseason, I think we too often overvalue it, but also in some cases too often undervalue it selectively. It doesn't make that much sense to me. Obviously, you can't hold against certain players, especially those of yesteryear before like the playoffs expanded to what they are now, that they didn't have as many opportunities. For someone like Billy Wagner, I hold it against him because he had opportunities and he sucked, right? For someone like Madison Bumgarner, who someday will have the chance to come in, that's a fascinating argument because Madison Bumgarner, you could credibly argue, was the best player in the postseason on like 2 championship teams and like basically beat the Royals single-handedly. That has to be taken into account because those games are so much more valuable. And if you cross perhaps a lesser threshold in the regular season, then we'll put you in. There's obviously the steroid element to it. I think the problem is we like to reduce so many of these kinds of conversations in our lexicon to the lowest common denominator, where I think it's diminishing the greatness or the goodness in some cases of a lot of these players by reducing them to those kinds of things, to say like they're compilers or they're accumulators, or they're flashes in the pan like an Utley or like a Mattingly, or it's small sample size in the playoffs. In reality, what we should be able to do is have the nuance to be able to blend all the attributes of what a player provided on a baseball field, regular and postseason, create a threshold for ourselves and say, all right, if you clear this particular bar, you're a Hall of Famer, whether you're a big Hall guy or a small Hall guy, and make the decision. But we like to have such microwavable conversations in our discourse that so often like we don't even have as much time as you and I have today to be able to discern like what matters and what doesn't. then lo and behold, go through every single player on the ballot and say yes or no based upon those criteria. So that's a very complicated, long answer to a very simple question. But when it comes to the Hall of Fame, which matters way more in baseball than in any other sport, I think it's appropriate to kind of approach it with that kind of rigor.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's a lot to go into it, and the people making the decisions may not. Every voter doesn't give it that much thought as probably you do.
Who doesn't have a vote, by the way?
All right, we'll get right back to that episode. But first, I got to let you know about one of our sponsors, Better. So Better Picks is an app. It's a daily fantasy app. I personally love using it, especially here in California where sports gambling is illegal. You just pick players to perform certain stats like Patrick Mahomes to not throw an interception, Christian McCaffrey to have more than 2 touchdowns. Whatever it is, you can pick up to 8 different picks and win up to 300x your money. Sometimes they even allow you to win up to 600x your money. It's just the Better app in the App Store. Use the code WTFStats, and it'll double your first deposit up to $500 worth of Better bucks. So back to your personal journey, I'm sure there was some point where you realized you weren't going to be a Hall of Fame baseball player. So what was kind of your journey of going from just a guy like everybody else that loves sports and plays sports through high school and college to transition to like working for ESPN? Because for me personally, my dream as a kid was to work at ESPN. I saw like Chris Berman. I was like, that looks like the coolest job ever. And he didn't really play sports at a high level, so it seems possible. But most people on ESPN, at least on camera, are former athletes. So for you, what was kind of the career path to get to where you are now?
So, at some point I realized that I wasn't going to be a big league ball player. That point probably came much later than it should have been. I would say that honestly, the biggest break that I ever got was failing out of business school in college, which is probably a bizarre answer to provide. But I think if I had been just a little bit better at accounting and a little bit better at business calculus and things of that nature, that I probably would have just been a pretty average businessman for my life and probably done just fine for myself and been perfectly happy. But in reality, I wound up stumbling upon a career path that much better suited my skill set and my passions, which, primarily were sports. I mean, I was a sports obsessed fan just like you were. And I like to tell people that ask me that question, like, there's really no difference between me and all of my friends growing up, except I was the one that failed out of business school. So I happened to get a degree in communication as a result because that would enable me to graduate on time. I got an internship with the sports information office at Cedarville where I did my undergrad. I then became a graduate assistant sports information director at LaSalle University in North Philadelphia because that's kind of the track I wanted to go on. I was into sports. I like covering sports. I was into collegiate athletics, and that's what I thought I wanted to do with my life. Maybe become an AD someday or something of that sort. And then, by chance, one day, randomly, a recruiter from ESPN Stats and Information stumbled onto campus and was asking my boss if he had any people that would be interested in working in sports, and I happened to be there that day. Like, that's literally how life works.
Wow.
Because I mean, if I had not met that guy that day, I'd probably be an SID today at Penn State or VCU or Palm Beach Atlantic or wherever the case may be. Like that.
What year was that?
That was 2014. And so when jobs at ESPN Stats and Information became available, I kept nagging this guy to such an extent that he sent me the openings. I was able to pass, the phone interviews and went up to Bristol for a couple of days of interviews and got an entry-level position at ESPN Stats and Information. And the rest is history. But that's how life works. Like, there's a handful of, sort of big breaks I can point to in my life. That was probably the first one that sort of informed who I am today. But that's what I tell young people is like, this was never part of the plan. I never had any interest or desire to work in media, nor to be forward-facing in front of a camera. If you had told me 10 years ago that I'd be co-hosting a radio show with Mike Greenberg, whom I listened to every day on my way to school growing up, I would have told you you're crazy. You're out of your freaking mind. You should be institutionalized. But that's where we're here today. That's what I did literally today. So it's funny. Life is wild and wonderful. It takes you to places that you might not expect. And I'm definitely a better man for it.
So what was that entry level job that you first started? What did that entail?
I was I think the position was called sports content researcher. So I was hired in the summer of 2014. Just for perspective, like most shows, if not every show at ESPN has an assigned researcher. In some cases, it might rotate. In some cases, it might be the person, the same person for every show for every day. Well, like, if you watch a Sports Center at 6 o'clock with El Duncan and Kevin Nagati, for example, like between 6 and 7, there'll be a person that supplies them with information and builds the full screen graphics and or in some cases, is in the research room answering questions on the phone or fielding email requests or putting together packets of information to preview games on ESPN's air or, anything of that nature. And so that's how I started out. It's basically like, I don't know if you ever watched the show Stump the Schwab growing up or are familiar with it. It's basically a show where like an ESPN researcher, like, competed against, sports fans that knew a lot of information. And that's when people ask me like where I work or what do I do, I say I work in that guy's department. Like, it's kind of the brains of the operation. And so that's how I got my start. I built full screen graphics, and I answered research requests and all those kinds of things. It's the group that inputs all the information in the bottom line. Like, it's that department, and they do wonderful work at the company. And about 9 months into my time there, Mike and Mike's researcher left to go take a new job. And as someone who was just fairly new in the department, fairly new in the company, I kind of wanted to have my weekends off. No one else wanted to wake up in the middle of the night to show up, like, literally at 3 o'clock in the morning to research a morning show. And I listened to those guys growing up. I said, what the heck? Like, why not give this a try? And I've basically spent every day, for the last 9 years by Mike Greenberg's side by that off chance decision. So again, it's one of those few things that, like, you never know at the time where life might lead you. But in this case, it led me all the way here.
Yeah. So you're been a big content producer for a while for Mike Greenberg, and he does a lot of early morning stuff. So I'm sure your week schedule is a lot of early mornings.
Yeah, I've basically woken up in the middle of the night for 9 years, which makes it difficult to be a sports fan and stay up and watch, like, Game 7 of the NBA Finals, and when the Phillies are in the World Series. Like, all the things make it very difficult, but it's, part of the trade-off. Like, when you work at ESPN and you work in production, very rarely do you work 8 to 5, because that's not how sports fans watch TV, right? So, but that's basically what it's been. I've always felt it's sort of my responsibility to help set the agenda for the day at the network. So to provide information, to provide stats, to provide any perspective, historical context, any color that can illuminate the mind of the sports fan. That's kind of what I try to charge myself to do every single day. Can I make our listener, can I make our viewer a little bit smarter? And that's the kind of question that I ask myself every single day, and the charge I aim to fill. That's kind of the point. And so as my role has evolved over time, from researcher to producer to now producer that does all sorts of stuff on and off the air, both on the radio and digital and things of that nature, I've never allowed myself to, like, lose track of the fact that I, just like you, am a sports obsessed, crazed, information lunatic, right? Who wants to know everything about sports, and if he doesn't know it, wants to know how to find every single thing, every modicum of information that he possibly can. And for as long as I do this, I'll never forget my early days as a researcher, because that's what I'm good at. Like, that's what I major in. And so if you ever hear me delving into irresponsible opinion or hot takes or inflammatory rhetoric, I'll have lost my way. I'd like to think that I'm a voice of reason, who is happy to provide context, who's happy to make the sports fan smarter, to add color and those kinds of things. At a time when our discourse, I think, is all over the place. I think ESPN does a really good job, and in some cases a really bad job, of illuminating the mind of the sports fan. But you got to remember, like, not all sports fans want the same thing. So there are certain places you'll go if you want to be yelled at. There are certain places you'll go if you want to be informed, and everywhere in between. I like to gravitate to the informed, because that's what I'm good at. That's what I'm best at. And from having a decade now of researching and producing information at the company, that's what I like to major in.
So I've just seen over the last couple of years, you're, like you said, progressing more from just the researcher to the producer, and I'm seeing you more and more, like, on air and on camera. How do you feel about being on camera or, like, on ESPN? Do you love the limelight, or do you prefer being off camera? What's your preference?
So it's a funny question you ask, because I truly never had any aspiration to be a forward-facing talent, and that's God's honest truth. I wasn't the kind of person that had a podcast in college. I didn't do really anything of this kind before now. And for years, when I just was researching and producing, I would do things like, podcast hits with Buster Olney on the Baseball Tonight podcast. I would do things like local hits in Philadelphia to preview Eagles games and things like that, more to scratch an itch than anything. But it wasn't until 2020 when Greeny put a microphone in front of my face when we sort of rejoined ESPN Radio, that this became a viable thing for me. At first, I think it was mostly because, we were coming out of COVID. He's sitting in a big room by himself and probably just wants to have a sidekick with him. And over the course of time, it kind of turned into something more. I'm now recognized as a co-host of the show. I have the opportunity to provide a lot more than just, stats to sort of fill in cracks here and there. And as you can probably tell by my speaking style and by my lack of experience, like, what you see is what you get. No one's ever going to confuse me for Walter Cronkite or Mike Greenberg, for that matter. But what I do have is the skill to be able to provide stats and information to support or refute basically anything in the world of sports, to provide trivia questions that people seem to really like too, And, I can deviate into opinion, but it's always informed opinion. I can deviate into debate, but it's always going to be informed. I think that's exceedingly important. And so anytime you hear me on the radio, anytime you see that, a clip that I might post, I always like to remember that. Like if a sports fan is tuning into the show on a given day, I want them to know in advance that what they're basically going to get from me. They're going to learn something. Or at minimum, I might spark a curiosity in something. I think that is exceedingly important because so much of our discourse is milquetoast. I see so many of the same and hear so many of the same regurgitated takes, regurgitated opinions across networks, across the world of sports, right? And that's fine. A lot of TV and radio is personality, is color, is entertainment. But the infotainment world we live in, info comes first. And so for as long as I'm on the media, to reiterate that point, I want to make sure that that's something that I lean into the most.
Yeah, I think it's great. I think you bring a unique perspective and a good mix to those guys on ESPN that are more just like personality and hot takes, and you're bringing in a good mix, and I think it's a good combination of both. So it seems like a common trend for you of going to ESPN and then being on camera. Things keep happening in a way that you didn't imagine and that you didn't really aspire and plan. So thinking about it now, like, do you have aspirations for the future or goals of like what you want to accomplish at ESPN or outside of ESPN?
I mean, the answer is yes, but unfortunately, I don't have those aspirations written in pen. Candidly, what I'd like to keep doing is more of this, more opportunities like these, because once you get that itch, you don't really want to stop scratching it. It isn't addicting necessarily, but like this is there's a little talent in all of us. I mean, you can't tell me that you weren't out in the driveway shooting baskets, pretending that you were Rich Eisen and Stuart Scott, right, doing the Sports Center top 10. There's a little bit of that in all of us. So I think in some sense, those kinds of opportunities are things I'm always going to continue seeking. The other thing that's always interested me, though, is the idea of actually working in sports. The idea of being able to make decisions that impact what happens on a baseball field, on a football field, on a basketball court. I don't know if I would ever delve into that world. I definitely have enough connections at ESPN now to where if so-and-so decided to become an offensive coordinator for some team or the manager of some team or whatever, whatever the case may be, an opportunity like that might present itself. It hasn't yet. But if Howie Roseman called me and asked if I wanted to be his assistant, if Dave Dombrowski called me and asked me if I wanted to be his scouting director, if Daryl Morey called me asking if I wanted to run his analytics department, that would be a phone call I would definitely take. Now it's a whole different world to go from the media to inside of our front office, and people have done it highly successfully, like John Lynch, and people have done it very unsuccessfully, like many people that I won't say. But that is also a world that I would be interested in exploring, especially in the world of baseball. So I could imagine that being an opportunity someday that I might consider. Now, the last thing I would say is I do have a master's degree in education, and do have the desire to talk to young people and get more people into this stuff, because as I'm sure you found with your Twitter feed and with conversations like these that you've had, this is kind of a booming, burgeoning industry in terms of people gravitating towards smart, gravitating towards stats and information, and gravitating towards the communication of these things. But there really isn't sort of an organized track to get you from where you might want to be to where I am today. Like if I wanted to do this when I was a younger person, there would have been no obvious way to do it. Like if you want to be a nurse, you know how to go, you know how to get there. If you want to be an accountant, you know how to get there. If you want to be an engineer, you know how to get there. If you want to be a sports content researcher at ESPN, you have to stumble upon a recruiter. At least that was my experience. And so I do have the desire someday, perhaps, to be able to pay it forward, for lack of a better term, to young people that have the same kind of desire that I do, because this is a job that, I mean, thousands of people would die to have, and I recognize that. And I would love the opportunity to be able to sort of edify people to be able to create a career path for themselves, because I feel that kind of question so often from people. And unfortunately, I don't have a direct answer in terms of how you can become me, for lack of a better term.
All right, we'll get right back to the episode. But first, I got to let you know about one of our sponsors, SeatGeek. So SeatGeek is the best platform to buy tickets on. It's better than all their competitors. I've used them all. We've all bought tickets for concerts, for sporting events. SeatGeek is truly the best. It's the easiest to use. And plus, you can get an additional $20 off when you use the code WTFStats. So use SeatGeek next time you buy some tickets with the code WTFStats. Gets you $20 off. Yeah, that's a good point. So at your time at ESPN and going through all that, what has been some of like your favorite like pinch me moments? Was it like when you first worked at Mike and Mike, or what were some of your fondest memories looking back at so far your ESPN career?
Okay, so I mean, there are many, as you might imagine. A few that will immediately come to mind. Very early on, I was researching SportsCenter with Hannah Storm, who's obviously a TV legend who I grew up watching and idolizing and admiring naturally. And I remember one day, I was doing like live Ryder Cup updates, and candidly, like at that time at least, I didn't know the first thing about the Ryder Cup. So I'm like, I'm just faking it back here. I've been here for like 2 months, right? And we're coming out of a break in SportsCenter, and like God's honest truth is like 30 seconds from now, like she's gonna read a piece of paper that I handed her in the next 30 seconds about the Ryder Cup, and basically no matter what it says is gonna make air. And so I throw something together, slap it together, sprint out to the studio, hand her the thing, exhale in my chair, and she's just reading verbatim some probably incorrect piece of information that I'm providing America about the Ryder Cup at the time. And I just thought to myself, like, that's pretty cool. Like she just said the thing that I handed her. And if I hadn't handed her the thing, then that wouldn't have happened. That would have been TV. That's how TV works. And so that was one moment for some reason that stuck out of my mind. I'll give you another one. I was my first 2 days I ever did Mike and Mike were the day of and the day after the first college football playoff national championship, Ohio State, Oregon. And I remember Greeny liking some information that I gave him and giving me an on-air shout out in one of those 2 days and thinking to myself, like, that's pretty cool. I could get used to that. And as it turns out, I've become very used to it over the last 9 years. So that obviously sparked something in me that has never went away. I'll give you one more because I always think I do this forever. But I had the opportunity to meet Cal Ripken Jr., who I told you at the beginning of our conversation was my first sports idol. So he came to Mike and Mike once, and it was obviously a thrill to meet him. I got to sit down and do a Facebook Live with him and just rifle off a bunch of questions while people were asking from home, which was ridiculously cool and fun, obviously, as someone who grew up admiring him. He came back to New York City to do Get Up at some point, I want to say in 2018. And I had the chance to have a catch with him. Like, it was like a whole show like built around me and Cal Ripken, which was the coolest thing in the world. But the coolest thing in the world was a year later when he and I think his agent came into the city to do other things, to do TV, I think with MLB Network and a couple other odds and ends as he was promoting a book. He wasn't on ESPN, and his agent reached out to me, and he just wanted to get lunch. And I just got lunch, and we just chatted for half an hour about random things, not having to do with my love and admiration for every ounce of his being. And that was like probably the coolest thing, actually, that ever happened to me at ESPN, because I mean, like, to say I grew up wanting to be Cal Ripken Jr. would be a massive understatement. I mean, like, Cal Ripken Jr. was infinitely more important to me than any person in my life. And it's one thing to meet him at work when, he's on the air doing shows that you're on and obviously has a vested interest in being engaging. It's a whole other thing to just want to hang out with me. And that got to happen. And so I would say, like, those were a few moments that I don't know why those three were the ones that stuck out to me, but just in thinking about my 10 years at ESPN or almost 10 years at ESPN, I think those are three that pretty, adequately encapsulate how cool it's been and what it's been like.
Yeah, that's really awesome being able to, like you said, outside of work, have lunch with someone you idolize as a kid, and like, that's insane.
Who's your favorite ball player? Who's your favorite ball player ever?
Ever? I mean, the first one that pops to mind is probably Chipper.
Yeah. So Chipper's a legend. I haven't had the chance to meet Chipper in person. He did do ESPN for a year, you might recall. I did produce a couple of his segments. All I ever did was text and talk to him on the phone. But even that's super cool. But think about Chipper calling you, wanting to have lunch, right? Like, it's not on the list of options. And so, like, I consider myself super lucky for having had that opportunity, even if it only happens once in my whole life.
Yeah, I mean, that's more than amazing. But anyways, transition to the book. Like you said, you work a lot with Mike Greenberg, and I saw the book and read it myself. And for those watching or listening who haven't heard of it, they basically go numbers 1 through 99, right? And just assign to 100 and assign some type of player or sports figure to each number. So some of them seem kind of obvious, like 8 would be Kobe Bryant, 12 is Tom Brady. But then there's also some other stretches like 76 being John Madden, because he had a 76 career win percentage and had his best season at 76. So looking at that book, I was just jealous of, like, I wish I was in the room with you and Greenberg, whoever else is there, like, arguing about each number. So I'm curious, like, which battles did you lose and which battles did you win?
Okay, I'm glad you asked that question. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna pull up my my working document there too, because we had like I put a handful of like numbers for that very question. So he and I did media last year, like we did like GMA and all the different like morning shows to promote these kinds of things. And one of the most common questions was the one that you just asked. And so I want to make sure that I have like the right numbers with which to answer your question. So I'm going to pull up on my Google Doc. This is my Got Your Number cheat sheet. This is what I like carried around with me to all of the different shows to make sure that I was able to answer this properly, because I want to make sure I do justice to that question, which a lot of people had. So you said 8 was obvious. 8 was not obvious because Cal Ripken Jr., Yogi Berra, and Troy Aikman all were number 8, as does Alexander Ovechkin, who probably, when it's all said and done, is going to have scored more goals than any player in the history of the NHL. Number 4 was challenging. We chose Bobby Orr. We chose Bobby Orr over Lou Gehrig and Brett Favre, which I think Lou Gehrig would have been my choice because, I mean, number 4, Lou Gehrig's number 4 was the first number ever retired in any sport. But I think historically speaking, Bobby Orr is an even greater player in his sport than Gehrig is in his, and that's really saying something. 11 was challenging. I would have chosen Mark Messier over Isaiah Thomas. He's a huge Isaiah guy. In the end, Isaiah wound up winning. Number 14, Pete Rose got number 14. You could have chosen Oscar Robertson. You could have chosen Ernie Banks, and you could have chosen Bob Cousy. Number 19, look, I'm just going to rattle off right now. This is sports pornography for you. I'm sorry. I got to do it. Number 19, we chose Johnny Unitas over Bob Feller, over Tony Gwynn, over Willis Reed. Over number 20, we chose Barry Sanders over Frank Robinson, Mike Schmidt, and Gary Payton. 21 was probably the most challenging. We chose Roberto Clemente, but Tim Duncan, Deion Sanders, and LaDainian Tomlinson all wore that number. Number 32 is worn by Jim Brown, Magic Johnson, and Sandy Koufax. I think the biggest miss was putting Gronk at 87 over Sidney Crosby. In hindsight, I think that was a miss because Sidney Crosby, I think, is unquestionably a greater hockey player than Gronk was a football player. Well, Gronk, I think, has occupied a greater celebrity without question, being Tom Brady's number 1 target for as many years, and now is one of the faces of the NFL, post game. But I think that's another tough one that I would probably go back and change if it were totally up to me. I mean, the truth of the matter is, like, that's part of the fun, part of the fun is debating. Like, you can't have 2 number 4s. We've found ways to get, athletes in later on. For example, we chose Jack Nicklaus at 18 over Peyton Manning, whom we gave 55, which matched his single season touchdown passes record that may or may not be broken someday. So we found ways to get other people in. We found a way to get Cal Ripken Jr. into the 90s, the year he broke the Lou Gehrig record and things of that nature. But honestly, like, choosing who was way more fun than actually researching and writing the book.
Yeah, I bet.
And spoiler alert, we have 2 more books coming out, both of which are much more debate heavy and much less like historical context heavy. Like, I actually consider Got Your Number to be more of a sports history book than a debate book. The debate is sort of the entry point because you're choosing, so-and-so over so-and-so. But it's not like we debate the numbers, and who deserves it within the chapter themselves. Like, if you open chapter 4, we're not debating Bobby Orr or Lou Gehrig, we're just celebrating Bobby Orr. And so I think our next couple books will scratch that itch of a sports fan even more so.
Gotcha. So who do you think was the best athlete that you couldn't find a number for in the book that got completely left out?
Goodness. So there's some early baseball players before they wore numbers. So, like, Walter Johnson's the greatest pitcher ever, but he didn't have a number. Like, numbers weren't a thing in sports yet. It kills me to have someone like Ted Williams not be in there. We chose John Elway over Mickey Mantle, which was pretty controversial. But, otherwise you're just having a never-ending parade of Yankees in the top 10 because obviously, like, every number is retired. Honestly, Randy Moss not being in and Terrell Owens being in really sticks to me because I think Terrell Owens was a great player, but an inarguably lesser player than Randy Moss. That's my opinion. There are probably 15 or 20 players, now that you mentioned it, some of whom I've already named, that, like, it just kills me that we weren't able to include. But again, like, that's part of the fun here. So we did the best we could to represent athletes from, like, other disciplines in sports. Like, for example, we found a way to get Muhammad Ali in, and Jesse Owens, and Michael Phelps, and people like that, because you can't really tell the story of American sport without including some of those. Like, we can't pretend like sports only were played by these, 4 major teams in team sports, right? And so we did the best we could. But the bottom line of it is, you have 100 chapters, you have 200 chapters, and so I think we did the best we could with the 100 chapters that we have. I will say, spoiler alert, ending with Gretzky at 99 and Wilt Chamberlain at 100 is pretty sick, and I'm glad that we ended the book the way that we did. We're going out with a freaking bang there.
Yeah, I like how it ended. The book was definitely, like, not what I expected when I first started, like the way you guys creatively got people to numbers, but I think altogether it's
And as
cool book.
someone who loves stats the way that you do, I'm guessing that like maybe not every chapter, but every few chapters, like there was a piece of information that I dug up that you found to be pretty wild. Because that's kind of what I did. Like I researched the book asking myself, what would I want to know? And if I were a stats obsessed sports fan, what would I want to learn? And as someone, I think you and I see sports very similarly. I'd like to think that there were times throughout the book that you said, oh, bleep to yourself because like a number really popped off the page to you. I had some friends that would text me on occasion like, I can't believe that about Jerry Rice, or I can't believe that about, fill in the blank. And it was some of the most rewarding feedback that I got the whole way through.
Yeah, like I said, I think just probably for you guys, the best part was just arguing about who gets what number and then putting the book together.
Right. But unfortunately, the viewer, the listener didn't get to experience any of that.
Yeah, I know. I tried to imagine it in my head, though. So I felt like every time I was going through it, I was like, oh, I bet they argued here. I bet they argued here.
I bet you got it right more often than not.
All right, we'll get right back to the episode. But instead of me plugging a sponsor, I'd actually just like to plug my own book that I wrote myself. The 500 Craziest WTF Stats in Sports History. After years of running the Instagram page and finding the craziest stats in sports, I put it all in one place for you. It's only $19 on Amazon Prime, free delivery, shows up in a couple days. Thanks to everyone supporting. Well, that was it on the book. The only other questions I had was just more of this upcoming Super Bowl, kind of like the stats, some interesting stats, because I know you and I both, like you said, are pretty stat obsessed, and I haven't really dug deep into finding some other than ones that just kind of find me. But what are some interesting stats or trends that you think can help like dictate this Super Bowl, or just things that you find interesting overall about it?
Sure. So I think from like a high level, big picture perspective, like obviously there are so many X's and O's thing that are going to dictate the outcome of the Super Bowl. I consider those to be more like, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday before the Super Bowl type topics. Right now, so all the shows that I'm working on, we're still kind of zooming out in terms of like what this means for the protagonists involved, right? Things of that nature. I find the discourse around Andy Reid to be fascinating. So as I've mentioned many times, I am a lifelong Philadelphia Eagles fan, which is to say I've seen Andy Reid lose way more big games than I've seen him win, at least as a fan of the Eagles. One of the big misconceptions is that Andy Reid's a big game coach. Andy Reid is definitively not a big game coach. Patrick Mahomes is a big game quarterback, and now Andy Reid has it. So Andy Reid in the playoffs is 14-3 with Mahomes as his quarterback, and his team's averaged 30.2 points a game. Those are staggering numbers. Mahomes is the only quarterback in the history of the NFL whose teams average 30 points a game in the playoffs. It is a staggering average. If you look at where Andy Reid was, though, before Patrick Mahomes came along, with Donovan McNabb and Jeff Garcia and Michael Vick and Alex Smith, all good, if not better than good, quarterbacks in their own right. Andy Reid was 11-13 in the playoffs when Patrick Mahomes became a starting quarterback, and his team averaged 22 points a game. So, as someone who saw Andy Reid fail more often than not on the biggest stages, I think that more than anything illuminates the extraordinary greatness of Patrick Mahomes. Like, it's not hyperbole to say that he's already the best quarterback of all time. Tom Brady is definitively the greatest. Patrick Mahomes can't become the greatest without playing 2 decades in the NFL and accumulating the kind of accomplishments that Brady did, and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and Wayne Gretzky, and like the all-time greats for whom like longevity was one of their great attributes. Henry Aaron, another obvious example. But this 6-year run by Patrick Mahomes is unfathomable. To have done what he has done in the last 6 months, to get to the Final Four in all 6 of those seasons, to have basically a chance to win all 6, to have gone to 4. And in the last 2 years to do it, after they traded their Hall of Fame receiver in Tyreek Hill to Miami, and to do it basically with your tight end being your primary possession receiver, has literally never happened in the history of pro football. And that's why over the next couple of weeks, I think I'm gonna make it a point. I'm dying to know if you agree with this, that Travis Kelce is on the verge of passing Gronk as the greatest tight end of all time. Now, Rob Gronkowski, in my opinion, is the greatest tight end ever, at least right this second, or at least entering this season, certainly. Is probably the best red zone player ever. No one is better at anything than Rob Gronkowski was in the red zone and catching touchdown passes. He provided Tom Brady so much value and high leverage. But Travis Kelce is doing stuff between the 20s that Rob Gronkowski never dreamed of doing. And to do it at this age, I mean, they've played 17 playoff games together, and Travis Kelce has caught 17 touchdown passes. It is beyond belief what he's doing. I don't have any idea if he's going to retire or want to keep playing. But I think there's a lot at stake here from that perspective. Because I think Travis Kelce is about to pass Gronk as the greatest tight end ever. And when it comes to Mahomes, I think the best way to underscore his greatness is comparing what Andy Reid looked like before he got there and what he looks like now.
No, yeah, you're absolutely right. So, like you said, the longevity thing is going to continue to, seems like, play in Kelsey's favor. And when it's all said and done, he probably will go down as the greatest. And yeah, in the middle of the field, I think he's by far the best. But I think from like a football standpoint, if you're a defensive coach, you'd rather scheme against Kelsey in the red zone than come up with a way to guard Gronk. So I think like that's a tough debate. But yeah, you're absolutely right. It's a different perspective that's not talked about. Is like, I remember the narrative of Andy Reid, like, not winning the big game, like not getting it done, not being able to. And now all of a sudden it's like, oh, is Andy Reid the greatest coach of all time? Like, I think there's one guy.
That's how great Patrick Mahomes is. Patrick Mahomes is so great that we have talked ourselves into Andy Reid being the greatest coach of all time, which 5 years ago would have been an astronomical idea. That's how great Patrick Mahomes is.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, now Brady's the GOAT. But I mean, it's crazy that right after, like, literally overlap of Tom Brady's legacy ending, comes in another guy that's when you're watching football, looks better than Brady. And then he's still young, so it's a lot still to be determined. But he's doing what Brady did. It's like 6 straight AFC championships, 4 Super Bowls in 6 years. And if he wins this one, it's like, all right, he's on pace.
And the Brock Purdy element of this is also fascinating. It's likewise fascinating to me because so much of the discourse around Purdy has been highly irresponsible. There is, for some reason, this like cognitive dissonance in our conversation where we can't separate Brock Purdy from Jimmy Garoppolo because Garoppolo also took them to the Super Bowl. But like in reality, it could not possibly be any more different.
Yeah, I saw your tweet about the 2 comparison of their playoffs. It's way different.
The numbers are these. In 2019, in the 2 games preceding the Super Bowl, Jimmy Garoppolo accounted for 29% of San Francisco's offense. In the 2 games preceding this year's Super Bowl, Brock Purdy has accounted for 74% of the 49ers offense. The second half of the last week against Detroit, when they had to have it, his QBR was 99.1. That's on a scale of 0 to 100. In the last 5 possessions against Green Bay, San Francisco scored 3 times. And in the last 5 possessions against Detroit, San Francisco scored 5 times. That's 8 of 10 in sort of have-to-have-it situations. And Brock Purdy engineered those drives. I think the last point that I'll make when it comes to Purdy and why he's not merely a color inside the lines quarterback is when he has been, like, so much of quarterback play is what happens when A isn't available, or what happens when you have to thrive in conflict rather than in order. Most anybody in the NFL can thrive when they have a clean pocket and guys are open. But the numbers are staggering, or were staggering last week in the NFC Championship game. So Brock Purdy was pressured on 15 plays in that game. And the 49ers gained 127 yards on those 15 plays. Conversely, Jared Goff was pressured 10 times in that game, and the Lions gained minus 13 yards on those 10 plays, which is, like, that is a quarterback-driven stat. Like, how a quarterback performs, right, under duress is much more driven by the skill of the player than it is by what the scheme is providing. Just like you might say, if a quarterback is benefiting a lot from yards after the catch, that is scheme-driven. If a quarterback is benefiting a lot more from air yards, that is often more quarterback-driven because more responsibility. The further the ball travels in the air, the more responsibility is on the quarterback. You know what quarterback leads the NFL this year in yak percentage? It's Patrick Mahomes. Remember a quarterback ranked in the bottom third of the league this year in yak percentage? It's Brock Purdy, with 10% less yak than Jimmy Garoppolo in 2019 when they went to the Super Bowl. So, like, people are just reciting lines, which would be one thing if it were true. It would be unoriginal and it would be unimaginative, but it would at least be true. This isn't even true. Like, Brock Purdy is actually making, like, more, like, heavy-hitting, pro-style, big boy throws than people are giving him credit for. Part of it because he looks like a choir boy. Part of it's because he was the last pick of the draft. Part of it's because Kyle Shanahan has enjoyed success with a trove of other quarterbacks, including Jimmy Garoppolo. But truthfully, the only quarterback that is compared to this version of Brock Purdy is Matt Ryan in 2016 when he won the MVP of the league and he should have won the Super Bowl. And I don't know exactly why we're not willing to accept the fact that Brock Purdy is good, but news alert, Brock Purdy is good.
I mean, I think Brock Purdy is borderline elite. Just from watching football, like you said, in those got-to-have-it moments, the way he stays cool, calm, and collected, and nothing seems to rattle him is like, that's elite. But it'll be interesting to see how the narrative in the story goes if he wins the Super Bowl, because then all of a sudden it's like, oh, he's never lost a playoff game except when his arm didn't work. And it's like in 2 years, he goes to the NFC Championship twice and wins the Super Bowl. Then it's like, oh, is he the next Tom Brady?
Right. If the Chiefs win the Super Bowl, Patrick Mahomes will win the MVP. If the 49ers win the Super Bowl, it will likely be whichever of Brock Purdy's weapons has the best game. Because we're just going to live in that world. And the conversation will naturally turn to, oh, yeah, it's fine. Like, he's great on the rookie contract. But what about when you have to pay the guy, right? Like, we'll just continue moving the goalposts for as long as we have to. Oh, can he actually win 3 Super Bowls in a row, right? Like, that's, no matter what, like, we just make up our mind that this is what you are. This is who you are. And any evidence to the contrary is explained away by some other thing that reaffirms your priors. I don't get it.
Yeah, I guess that's just human nature.
That's right. It's human nature. That's exactly right.
So for you, looking at the protagonist, like you said, just the characters and the human beings in it, can also alongside with like the statistics, looking at both sides, like how do you see the game going, and what are your early Super Bowl predictions?
So I mean, look, it's obvious that like Travis Kelce is a big X factor here. It's obvious that, the Kansas City needs to stop the run because Christian McCaffrey's a Hall of Fame back. Like, a lot of things are obvious. I think a little bit less obvious is the critical matchup between Nick Bosa, Chase Young, and Jawan Taylor Donovan Smith. That's a matchup that I think could very likely key the result of the game. We know, because we have proof of concept, that 3 years ago, when Patrick Mahomes lost the Super Bowl to Tampa, it was because his offensive line didn't hold up, and because he was running like a chicken with his head cut off behind the line of scrimmage, throwing the ball, falling down on the ground from like sidearm. Like, that was like the defining image of that Super Bowl is Patrick Mahomes throwing that ball like he's Dan Quisenberry, right? That was the defining image of that Super Bowl. Nick Bosa and Chase Young are really good. And if the Chiefs find themselves in 3rd and pass, if they find themselves having to play from a deficit and it becomes a drop-back game, Patrick Mahomes is more than capable of still winning. But I don't know if those tackles, which are the weak link of the offensive line, are capable of winning. Like, the best way to beat the 49ers is to basically split your pass run ratio 50-50, because the weakest part of that defense is in between the numbers. Like, they're like, you can run on them. We know that for sure. And that's something that the both the Lions and the Packers did somewhat successfully. They get out to an early lead. They were able to Bosa and Young, less effective in the run game, able to sort of set the edge and beat those guys. In some cases, you can even run up the middle on Javon Hargrave. But if you wind up in a situation where it's 3rd and long, Nick Bosa and Chase Young can eat. And so I think that's probably the most critical matchup of the game. In the end, I think Mahomes is good enough to overcome any deficiencies. I think we'll probably see a couple of false starts, but not too many blown blocks. I have a very difficult time picking against Kansas City right now, because I'm not sure that they don't have the better defense and they have the best quarterback ever. I don't mean to be reductive with my logic. I think there's a decent chance I could change my mind between now and then. But in the end, I think you're getting the most value by playing the Chiefs on the money line, because you're getting some juice there, and because I don't think the 49ers right now are playing their best ball, what the Chiefs are. Like, if you just look at the resumes, say, over the last 2 months or so, the 49ers aren't the same team. I mean, really, ever since Baltimore exposed them a little bit, I'm not convinced that San Francisco has that kind of juice. And I actually don't trust Brock Purdy to have to play from 3rd and pass or play from a 10-point deficit, because Steve Spagnuolo is so good at simulating pressure and disguising coverage. And so ultimately, if I had to pick the game today, I would take Kansas City to win the game, in one that would probably be in like the low to mid 40s if you're trying to play the total, which is right now 47.5. I think the Chiefs' clearest path to win is something like a 24-20 game. If the game hits the over, I think that would be the 49ers game to lose that.
That's interesting. Yeah, I agree mostly. I think, like you said, Mahomes is the greatest, and I could never bet against him in these situations. And
it's difficult too.
Yeah. But I mean,
Most
the 49ers
definitely
have been playing well from behind in these last couple of games. And
that's not a strategy, though. Like,
yeah,
it's not a strategy. It's a skill, but it's not a strategy. It's overcomable against Green Bay, and it's overcomable against Detroit when you're at home. I think it's not overcomable against the Kansas City Chiefs, who
that's true.
Demonstrated in the last 2 weeks that they can basically beat you however you decide you're going to lose.
Yeah. I just wonder, like, if like guys like Kittle or who lost that Super Bowl to the Chiefs a couple of years ago, like I'm sure you've seen the clips of him like on the sideline saying he wants revenge, and like how much extra that's going to bring in. I don't know how many guys on that roster were on the 49ers roster were there last time, but I don't know how history goes of teams that have previously lost to the Super Bowl to that team, how that goes. I don't know if you've looked at that before.
I've not looked at that research. 5 years is a pretty long time, so the roster's going to turn over a lot. But that's not one thing that I pay much attention to. Is the more like interpersonal factor. Like, this is going to be a game decided by execution. Like, obviously, like everyone's going to be amped up,
Yeah.
And I don't have any like worry that, there's going to be one side or the other that's going to be more or less disciplined necessarily. Like, I think generally speaking, these are teams that are going to play in character. If the Chiefs defense does to Brock Purdy what the Ravens did, then he's probably going to give the game away. If Nick Bosa and Chase Young can spook Donovan Smith and Jawan Taylor, then you're going to see 3 or 4 false starts, and it's going to back up the Chiefs, and it's going to create tough situations for them. Ultimately, the game's going to be decided by execution, by what's sort of won and lost in the margins. The last thing I'll leave you with before you let me go is I actually view the Chiefs as having a pretty considerable in-game coaching advantage, which is never something I could have imagined saying with Andy Reid in a big game like this. But I do think that Kyle Shanahan, like, his teams thrive when they have to play from behind because he doesn't then change his game script. But we've seen Kyle Shanahan in the past make very questionable, overly conservative decisions in the playoffs, famously blowing the 28-3 lead. Obviously, he was the offensive coordinator for the Falcons and not the head coach. But that was a game that he had no business losing. Candidly, he shouldn't have lost the Super Bowl 5 years ago. He shouldn't have lost to the Rams in the playoffs 2 years ago. Like, this is a guy that has a pretty checkered past. Like, he does Monday through Saturday, I think he might be the best coach in the whole sport. But I would be a little spooked if I were a 49ers fan and asking him to potentially preserve the lead, because that puts him in a situation where I think he often plays too conservatively, too much like his father. Whereas when you're actually going to let Brock Purdy grip it and rip it, that's when their offense is actually at its best, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's a good take. I think I agree with you. I mean, I'm a Falcons fan, so I've seen it firsthand, so I know what you're talking about. Bringing up battle scars.
My condolences.
But yeah, that was it. So today is January 31st, so you heard it here. Paul Hembo predicts the Chiefs are going to win. So if you hear him talking on ESPN next week saying the 49ers are going to win, he's lying. But that's all I have. I really appreciate you coming on. Love talking sports with you. Love hearing your background. Is there anything else you want to tell the listeners or the viewers, or where to find you, or anything else about your book?
Look, if you like this podcast, if you like my content, if you like your content, there's a good chance that if you don't have a copy of my book, you're going to love it. Again, it's called Got Your Number, anywhere you buy books. Greedy and I have a couple more in the pipeline, and I can assure you, if you like that one, you're going to like these two, because they're sort of from the same family and the same genre. But I appreciate you taking the time, not only to plug that, but to talk sports with you. It's a pleasure, and hopefully you and I get a chance to do that again soon.
Hope so too, man. I appreciate you. Have a good one, and that's a show.